She thought marriage to a man of God would save her. Instead, he locked her in a room and set it on fire. Now, with half her face scarred and a tin box of secrets clutched to her chest, Leora Vance hides by the tracks at Bitter Hollow Station, waiting to disappear. But a quiet cowboy with storm-gray eyes sees what everyone else won't: a woman worth saving. This is the story of how she reclaimed her future from the ashes. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far her story travels. The train was late. Leora Vance had been sitting by the tracks for 3 hours, and still the rails hummed with nothing but wind and the occasional skitter of tumbleweeds. The platform at Bitter Hollow Station was little more than weathered planks and a crooked sign that creaked in the evening air. Dusk was settling over the Montana plains like a bruise, purple and deep and endless. She kept her face turned away from the handful of travelers waiting under the station's tin roof. Her shawl was pulled low, covering the left side of her face, the side that no longer looked like it belonged to a person, the side that made children stare and women cross themselves. In her lap, she held a small tin box. It was dented, scratched, no bigger than a prayer book, but it was heavier than anything she'd ever carried. The wind picked up, and with it came the whispers. "That's her. Poor thing. I heard she tried to kill herself, threw herself into a fire. No, I heard her husband did it. Reverend Brock, can you imagine?" "Hush. Don't speak ill of a man of God." Leora's fingers tightened around the tin box. She didn't look up. She'd learned not to. Looking up meant seeing the pity, the suspicion, the fear. It meant answering questions she couldn't afford to answer. Not here. Not yet. A woman in a buttoned-up traveling coat approached the bench where Leora sat. For a moment, Leora thought she might sit down. But the woman's eyes flicked to Leora's shawl, to the faint edge of scarred skin peeking out beneath the fabric, and she turned sharply away. Leora exhaled slowly. She was used to it. She had been sitting there since midday, ever since the stagecoach from Shepherd's Bend had dropped her at the station with nothing but the clothes on her back and the box in her hands. The ticket agent had looked at her like she was a ghost. Maybe she was. The train to Larkspur County was supposed to arrive at 2 o'clock, then 4. Now the sun was sinking and the platform was emptying, and Leora was starting to realize that the train might not come at all, and if it didn't come, she had nowhere to go. Behind her, the station door swung open with a groan. She heard boots on wood, slow, deliberate. She didn't turn around. "You waiting on the Larkspur line?" The voice was low, rough-edged, like gravel under a wagon wheel. It wasn't unkind. Leora didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the tracks. The boots came closer, stopped a few feet away. "That train's not coming," the voice said. "Bridge washed out near Copperhead Pass. Won't be another one through here for 3 days." Leora's chest tightened. 3 days. She didn't have 3 days. She didn't even have 3 hours. "You got somewhere to stay?" She shook her head once. Short, final. There was a pause. Then the man crouched down, slow and careful, so he was level with her line of sight. She still didn't look at him. "Name's Rhett Calder," he said. "I'm heading back to my place about 10 miles north of here. Got a spare room. Fire's warm. Food's plain, but it's decent." Leora's hands trembled against the tin box. She didn't know this man, didn't know his voice, his face, his intentions, but she knew what happened to women who trusted too easily. She'd lived it. "I'm not asking for anything," Rhett continued, his tone steady, "and I'm not going to pry. But it's getting cold, and you look like you've been running a long time." Finally, she turned her head, just enough to see him. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 40, maybe older. His face was weathered, lined by sun and wind and years spent outdoors. His hat was pulled low, shadowing eyes that were pale gray, like smoke or distant rain. He had the kind of face that didn't give much away, quiet, unreadable. But his eyes weren't cruel. "Why?" she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, barely used. Rhett tilted his head slightly. "Why what? Why would you help me?" He was quiet for a moment, considering, then he shrugged. "Because nobody else is." It was such a simple answer, so plain, and somehow that made it feel true. Leora looked down at the tin box in her lap. She thought of the letters inside, the names, the dates, the confessions written in shaking hands. She thought of the man who'd put her here, Reverend Elias Brock, beloved preacher, husband, monster. She thought of the locked room, the smell of kerosene, the sound of the match. She thought of how no one had believed her when she'd stumbled out of the burning house with half her face melting. And she thought of how, for the first time in months, someone was offering her a choice instead of taking it away. "I don't have any money," she said quietly. "Didn't ask for any. I can't explain why I'm here. Don't need you to." She met his eyes, searched them for lies, for traps, for the things men hid behind kind words. But all she saw was patience. "All right," she whispered. Rhett stood, offering his hand. She didn't take it. Instead, she rose on her own, clutching the tin box to her chest like a shield. He didn't seem offended. He just turned and started walking toward the edge of the platform, where a sturdy bay horse was tied to a post. A bedroll and saddlebag were strapped behind the saddle. "You ride?" he asked. She nodded. "Good. We'll double up. It's not far." He untied the horse and swung up into the saddle with an ease that spoke of decades in the saddle. Then he reached down. This time, she took his hand. He pulled her up behind him, and she settled onto the horse's back, careful to keep space between them. The tin box was wedged between her body and his back. She could feel the heat of him through his coat, solid and real. "Hold on," Rhett said simply. She gripped the edge of the saddle, and then they were moving. On. The ride north was quiet. The plains stretched out around them in all directions, vast and empty and beautiful in a lonely kind of way. The sky was deepening to indigo, and the first stars were beginning to prick through the fabric of dusk. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Leora kept her eyes on the horizon. She didn't look back at Bitter Hollow Station. There was nothing there for her. There was nothing anywhere for her. Except, maybe, this. After about half an hour, Rhett spoke. "You hungry?" She realized she was. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. "Yes?" "We'll stop at the cabin. I've got stew on the stove, not much, but it'll fill you up." She didn't answer. She didn't know how. Another stretch of silence, then, "You got a name?" She hesitated. Names were dangerous. Names could be traced. But something in his tone, something unbothered, undemanding, made her answer. "Leora." "Leora," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "That's a good name." She didn't tell him the rest. Didn't tell him that it used to be Leora Brock, that she'd taken her maiden name back the day she'd stolen the tin box and run. They rode on. The cabin appeared just as the last light was fading from the sky. It was small, timber-built, low to the ground, with a stone chimney and a single window glowing faintly with firelight. There was a barn off to one side, a chicken coop, a well. Everything was neat, orderly, quiet. Rhett dismounted and helped her down. She stood for a moment, swaying slightly, her legs unsteady after the ride. "Go on inside," he said, nodding toward the door. "I'll take care of the horse." She walked slowly toward the cabin, her boots crunching on the dry earth. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open. Warmth hit her immediately, blessed, real warmth. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of venison stew filled the small space. There was a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the far wall. Everything was simple, clean, sparse. She stood in the doorway, unsure. Behind her, she heard Rhett leading the horse toward the barn. She stepped inside and closed the door. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe enough to breathe. Rhett came back 10 minutes later, his hat dusted with snow that had started to fall. He stomped his boots on the threshold and hung his coat on a peg by the door. "Cold's coming in," he said. He moved to the stove and ladled stew into 2 tin bowls. He set one on the table in front of her. "Eat." She stared at the bowl, her stomach twisted with hunger and suspicion in equal measure. Rhett sat down across from her and started eating. He didn't watch her, didn't wait for her, just ate. Slowly, she picked up the spoon. The stew was simple: venison, potatoes, carrots, salt. But it was warm, and it was real, and after the first bite, she couldn't stop. They ate in silence. When she finished, she set the spoon down carefully. "Thank you." Rhett nodded. "You're welcome." He stood and cleared the bowls, then poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove. He set one in front of her. "You can sleep in the bed," he said. I'll take the floor. No, she said quickly. I can't. You can, he interrupted, his tone firm but not harsh. And you will. I've slept on worse. She wanted to argue, but she was so tired, so bone-deep exhausted that even the thought of protest felt impossible. All right, she whispered. Rhett pulled a blanket from a trunk in the corner and spread it near the fire. Then he sat down on the floor, back against the wall, and pulled his hat low over his eyes. Leora sat at the table for a long time, holding the tin box, staring into the fire. Finally, she stood. She walked to the bed and lay down fully clothed, the box tucked under her pillow. She didn't sleep, but for the first time in months, she didn't cry either. The next morning, Leora woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood. She sat up slowly, disoriented. Sunlight streamed through the window, bright and cold. The fire had been rebuilt. There was bread on the table and a pot of coffee still warm on the stove. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, Rhett was chopping wood in the yard, his breath misting in the freezing air. He worked with steady, methodical rhythm, each swing precise. She watched him for a long time. He didn't know her, didn't know what she'd done, where she'd come from, what she was running from. And yet he'd given her food, warmth, shelter. He'd asked for nothing. She didn't understand it, but she also didn't want to leave. Pause. Over the next few days, a fragile routine formed. Rhett didn't ask questions. He worked, mending fences, feeding animals, hauling water. Leora stayed inside mostly, keeping to herself, speaking only when spoken to. But slowly, carefully, she began to trust. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Rhett spoke. "You don't have to tell me," he said quietly. "But if you're in trouble, I can help." Leora stared into the flames. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of tea. "I'm in trouble," she said finally. Rhett waited. "My husband," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's a preacher. Reverend Elias Brock. People love him. They think he's a saint." She paused, swallowed hard. "He locked me in a room and set it on fire." Rhett's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Something cold and sharp. "Why?" "Because I found out what he was doing to the other girls, the ones who came to him for help, for guidance." Her voice cracked. "I found their letters. I kept them. And when he found out..." She stopped, couldn't say the rest. Rhett was silent for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Where is he now?" "Looking for me." "And the letters?" She reached under her shawl and pulled out the tin box, set it on the table between them. "Here." Rhett looked at the box, then at her. "Then we take them to the law." "They won't believe me," Leora said, her voice breaking. "They never do." Rhett met her eyes. "Then we make them believe." And for the first time since the fire, Leora felt something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope. The tin box sat between them on the table like a confession waiting to be heard. Leora's hands were still trembling as she pulled them back into her lap, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters with a sound like bones shaking. Rhett reached for the box slowly, carefully, as if it might shatter. "May I?" Leora nodded, unable to speak. He opened it with hands that were surprisingly gentle for their size and calluses. Inside were dozens of letters, some folded neatly, others crumpled and stained. Some were written on fine stationery, others on scraps of brown paper. The handwriting varied, some elegant, some barely legible, but the words, Rhett could see even at a glance, carried the same weight. He pulled out one letter and began to read. His jaw tightened with each line. "How many?" he asked quietly, not looking up. 17, Leora whispered. 17 girls over 8 years. Those are just the ones I found. There might be more." Rhett set the letter down carefully, as if it were made of glass. "And he burned you for this. He said I was a liar, that I was trying to destroy a man of God. He locked me in the storage room behind the church, poured kerosene along the doorframe, and struck a match." Her voice was flat now, drained of emotion. She'd told the story so many times in her head that it had stopped feeling real. I broke through the window. The glass cut my arms. My dress caught fire. I rolled in the dirt until the flames went out, but by then, she touched the shawl covering the left side of her face. By then it was too late. Who saw? No one. It was night. The church sits alone on a hill outside town. By the time I made it to the road, he'd already put out the fire and cleaned up the evidence. When people found me the next morning, he told them I'd gone mad, that I'd tried to kill myself because I couldn't bear children. She laughed bitterly. They believed him. Of course they believed him. He's Reverend Elias Brock. He feeds the poor. He buries the dead. He marries the young couples and baptizes their babies. Why would he lie? Rhett's hands had curled into fists on the table. You got family. Anyone who could have helped you? My parents died when I was 16. Fever took them both within a week of each other. Elias was the one who presided over their funeral. He was so kind to me, so gentle. When he asked me to marry him a year later, I thought... She stopped, shaking her head. I thought God had sent me a protector. He sent you a devil in Sunday clothes, Rhett said quietly. Leora looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his face that she hadn't expected. Not pity, not disgust, just a cold, steady anger that burned like winter frost. The law in Shepherd's Bend won't touch him, she said. The sheriff goes to his church. Half the town council does. When I tried to tell people, they called me hysterical, demon-possessed. One woman spit in my face and told me I should be ashamed for slandering a holy man. Then we don't go to Shepherd's Bend, Rhett said. He stood and walked to a shelf near the door, pulling down a rolled map. He spread it across the table, pushing the tin box aside. Larkspur County, 3 days' ride southeast. The territorial judge there is a man named Horace Weatherby. He's old, mean as a snake, but he's honest. Doesn't care if you're a preacher or a peddler. If you break the law, he'll hang you for it. You know him? Testified in his court 5 years back. Cattle rustling case. He listened to the evidence and made his ruling. Didn't play favorites. Rhett tapped the map. We get these letters to him. He'll hear you out. Leora stared at the map, at the vast expanse of territory between Rhett's cabin and Larkspur County. 3 days is a long time. Elias will come looking for me. Let him come. There was something in the way Rhett said it, something final and immovable, that made Leora believe him. She didn't know why this man, this stranger, had decided to help her, but she was too tired to question it anymore. When do we leave? She asked. 2 days. Need to prepare supplies, make sure the route's clear. In the meantime, you rest. Get your strength back. He folded the map and set it aside. You're safe here. Leora wanted to believe him, but she'd believed in safety before, and it had nearly killed her. Still, she nodded. All right. That night, she slept more deeply than she had in months. The next morning, Rhett left early to ride into the nearest settlement, a tiny crossroads called Broken Spoke, about 6 miles west. He needed to buy supplies and gather information about the roads to Larkspur County. He told Leora to stay inside, keep the door barred, and not open it for anyone. I'll be back before sundown, he said, pulling on his coat. You hear riders coming, you take that box and hide in the root cellar out back. Don't come out until you hear my voice. Understood? She nodded, feeling like a child being given instructions. But she didn't argue. Fear had taught her to listen. After he left, the cabin felt enormous and empty. Leora busied herself with small tasks, washing the breakfast dishes, sweeping the floor, mending a tear in one of Rhett's shirts that she found draped over a chair. It felt strange to do domestic work again. In the months since the fire, she'd been running, hiding, barely surviving. She'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist in a space without terror breathing down her neck. But the peace didn't last. Around midday, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Her blood turned to ice. She moved quickly, grabbing the tin box and slipping out the back door. The root cellar was a few yards behind the cabin, hidden beneath a weathered wooden hatch covered in dead grass. She pulled it open and descended into the darkness, pulling the hatch closed above her. The cellar smelled of earth and potatoes. It was cold and damp, and she could hear her own breathing echoing in the confined space. She pressed her back against the dirt wall and waited. Above, she heard voices. You sure this is the place? Calder's cabin, yeah. My cousin worked a cattle drive with him last year. Said he's a loner, keeps to himself. Think the woman's here? Only one way to find out. Leora's heart hammered in her chest. She clutched the tin box tighter, her fingernails digging into the metal. There was a loud knock on the cabin door. Then another. Then the sound of boots on the porch, creaking wood. "Nobody home," one of the men said. "Check the barn." Footsteps moving away. Leora closed her eyes and prayed to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, she heard the horses leaving, the hoofbeats fading into the distance. She stayed in the cellar for another hour, just to be sure. When she finally emerged, the sun was lower in the sky, and the cabin was exactly as she'd left it. But the peace was shattered. They'd found her, or at least they were looking. Elias knew where she was. Rhett returned just before dusk, his saddlebags loaded with supplies. He took one look at Leora's face and knew something had happened. "What is it?" "Men came," she said, her voice shaking. "Two of them. They were asking about a woman. I hid in the cellar like you said." Rhett's expression darkened. He set the saddlebags down and moved to the window, scanning the yard. "You see their faces?" "No, I didn't look, but one of them knew your name, said his cousin worked with you." Rhett cursed under his breath. "Frank Darrow. He's got a loudmouth cousin named Pete. Works odd jobs around Broken Spoke." He turned back to her. "We leave tonight." "Tonight? But you said—" "Plans changed. If they know you're here, they'll be back with more men. We can't wait." He started pulling supplies from the saddlebags: jerky, hardtack, canteens, ammunition. "Pack light. Only what you need. We ride in an hour." Leora didn't argue. She moved quickly, gathering the few possessions she had: a change of clothes, a blanket, the tin box. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from something else, something like determination. As the sun set and the temperature dropped, Rhett saddled two horses, his bay and a smaller roan mare he kept for packing gear. He loaded the saddlebags with care, balancing the weight, checking the cinches twice. Leora watched him work. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't stop moving. "Doing what?" "Risking everything for me. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Rhett paused, his hands resting on the saddle. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he said quietly, "I had a sister once, younger than me. Sweet girl. She got married to a man we all thought was decent, respectable. Went to church every Sunday, worked hard, didn't drink." He tightened the cinch with more force than necessary. 2 years later she was dead. Fell down the stairs, they said. Broke her neck. But I saw the bruises on her arms, saw the way she flinched when he touched her." Leora's breath caught. "I didn't do anything," Rhett continued, his voice rough. "Told myself it wasn't my business, that she was a grown woman, made her own choices. And then she was gone, and it was too late." He turned to face Leora, and his eyes were hard. "I won't make that mistake again." Leora felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry, just survive." He handed her the reins to the roan. "Can you ride through the night?" "Yes." "Good. We'll take the old cattle trail southeast. It's longer, but it'll keep us off the main roads. If we push hard, we can make it to Larkspur County in 2.5 days. They mounted up as the last light faded from the sky. The temperature was dropping fast, and Leora could see her breath misting in the cold air. She pulled her shawl tighter and adjusted the tin box, which she'd tied securely to her saddle. Rhett rode up beside her. "You ready?" She looked back at the cabin one last time. It had been a refuge, however brief, but safety was an illusion. She knew that now. "I'm ready." They rode into the darkness. The first night was brutal. The cold cut through their clothes like knives, and the trail was rough and uneven, forcing them to move slowly. Rhett led the way, his eyes sharp even in the dim moonlight. Leora followed, her body aching, her mind numb with exhaustion. They stopped once, around midnight, to rest the horses and eat a handful of jerky. They didn't build a fire. Too risky. "How much farther to the county line?" Leora asked, her teeth chattering. "Another day and a half if we keep this pace." Rhett handed her a canteen. "Drink. You need to stay hydrated." She drank, the water so cold it hurt her throat. "What if we don't make it?" "We'll make it." "But what if—" We'll make it, Rhett repeated, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Leora wanted to believe him, but the darkness felt too big, too heavy, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Elias was out there somewhere, hunting her. They rode on. By dawn, they'd crossed into rougher terrain, hills and rocky outcroppings that provided some cover but slowed their progress. Rhett found a shallow ravine sheltered by scrub pines, and they stopped to let the horses graze and rest for a few hours. Leora dismounted stiffly, her legs trembling. She sank down onto a flat rock and buried her face in her hands. Rhett crouched beside her. You holding up? I don't know, she admitted. I keep thinking, what if this doesn't work? What if the judge doesn't believe me either? What if Elias catches us before we even get there? Then we fight, Rhett said simply. I'm not a fighter. Yes, you are. He met her eyes. You walked through fire and lived. You stole those letters and ran. You're still breathing, still moving. That's fighting. Leora looked at him, at the quiet certainty in his face, and felt something shift inside her. Maybe he was right. Maybe survival was its own kind of war. Thank you, she said softly. Rhett nodded and stood. Get some sleep. I'll keep watch. She lay down on her blanket, using her saddle as a pillow, and closed her eyes. Despite everything, she slept. She woke to the sound of Rhett's voice, low and urgent. Leora, get up. Her eyes snapped open. The sun was higher now, mid-morning maybe. Rhett was standing at the edge of the ravine, looking back the way they'd come. What is it? She scrambled to her feet. Riders, 3, maybe 4, about a mile back. Her stomach dropped. Elias? Don't know yet, but we're not waiting to find out. Mount up. They moved fast, packing their gear in minutes and swinging into their saddles. Rhett led them out of the ravine and up into the hills, choosing paths that were rocky and hard to track. But the riders behind them were persistent. By noon, they could see the dust cloud rising in the distance. They're gaining, Leora said, her voice tight with fear. Rhett's jaw was set. There's a line shack about 5 miles east, Old Trapper's cabin. We can make a stand there if we have to. A stand? Rhett, there's only 2 of us. And we've got the high ground and surprise. That's worth more than numbers. He spurred his horse faster. Come on! They rode hard, the horse's hooves pounding against the earth. Leora's heart was racing, her breath coming in short gasps. She'd been running for so long, she was so tired of running. The line shack appeared just as Rhett had described, a small, dilapidated structure tucked against a hillside, half hidden by overgrown brush. They dismounted quickly, leading the horses inside the sagging structure. Stay low, Rhett said, pulling a rifle from his saddle scabbard. Don't show yourself unless I tell you to. Leora nodded, her mouth dry. They waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, finally, the riders appeared. There were 4 of them, just as Rhett had guessed. They rode slowly, scanning the hills. One of them was a big man with a thick beard. Another was younger, wiry, with a mean look in his eyes. The other 2 were nondescript, hired muscle. And leading them, sitting tall in his saddle, was a man in a black coat and a preacher's collar. Reverend Elias Brock. Leora felt her entire body go cold. She pressed herself against the wall of the shack, trembling. Rhett saw him too. His grip tightened on the rifle. Elias reined in his horse about 50 yards from the shack. He sat there for a long moment, perfectly still, his eyes scanning the landscape. Then he spoke, his voice carrying easily across the distance. Leora. She flinched at the sound of her name. I know you're here, my dear. I know you're frightened, but you don't need to be. Come out, and we can talk. I forgive you for what you've done. God forgives you. Come home, and we'll forget this ever happened. Leora's hands were shaking so hard she could barely breathe. Rhett glanced at her, his expression grim. Then he called out, his voice hard as iron. She's not going anywhere with you. Elias's head turned toward the shack. A slow smile spread across his face. Ah, Mr. Calder, I presume. My wife has a talent for finding protectors. But you should know, sir, that she is unwell, delusional. She needs care, not encouragement. Your wife, Rhett said evenly, has scars that say otherwise. The smile faded from Elias's face. You have no idea what you're involving yourself in. I know exactly what I'm involved in, and I know you're not leaving here with her. Elias sighed, almost regretfully. Then he nodded to the men beside him. They drew their guns. Rhett fired first. The shot echoed across the hills like thunder, and one of the hired men fell from his saddle with a cry. The others scattered, diving for cover behind rocks and brush. "Stay down!" Rhett barked at Leora, levering another round into the chamber. Gunfire erupted. Bullets slammed into the walls of the shack, sending splinters flying. Leora covered her head, her ears ringing. Rhett fired again, methodically, calmly. Another man went down. But Elias was moving, circling around toward the back of the shack. Leora saw him through a gap in the boards and screamed a warning. Rhett spun, but he was too late. Elias kicked open the back door and lunged inside, grabbing Leora by the arm. She fought him, clawing at his face, but he was stronger. "Enough!" Elias roared, pressing a knife to her throat. "Drop the rifle, Mr. Calder, or I will spill her blood right here." Rhett froze, the rifle halfway to his shoulder. "I said drop it." Slowly, Rhett lowered the rifle and set it on the ground. Elias smiled. "Good. Now step back." Rhett stepped back, his hands raised, his eyes locked on Leora. "You see, my dear," Elias said softly into Leora's ear, "you can't escape me. You belong to me. Before God and man, you are mine." "No," Leora whispered, and then louder. "No." She drove her elbow into his ribs with everything she had. Elias gasped, his grip loosening for just a second. It was enough. Leora tore free and threw herself to the side. Rhett moved like lightning. He snatched up the rifle and fired. The bullet caught Elias in the shoulder, spinning him around. He staggered, blood blooming across his black coat, and fell to his knees. The remaining men outside, seeing their leader down, turned and fled. Rhett crossed the room in 2 strides and kicked the knife away from Elias's hand. Then he stood over him, the rifle aimed at his head. "Give me one reason," Rhett said quietly. "Not to finish this." Elias looked up at him, clutching his bleeding shoulder. His face was pale, twisted with pain and rage. "You'll hang for this. I'm a man of God. They'll hang you." "Maybe," Rhett said, "but you'll be dead. Seems like a fair trade." Leora stepped forward, her breath still ragged. She looked down at the man who had tortured her, burned her, hunted her. And for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. "No," she said. Rhett glanced at her. "Leora." "No," she repeated. "I want him to stand trial. I want the world to see what he is." Elias laughed bitterly. "You think anyone will believe you? You're a scarred, mad woman. I'm beloved, respected." Leora crouched down, meeting his eyes. "I have the letters, Elias. All of them. 17 girls. And when they hear their stories, when they see the proof, no one will remember your sermons. They'll only remember what you are, a monster." For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. Rhett pulled a length of rope from his saddlebag and tied Elias's hands behind his back, cinching it tight. "Get on your horse," he ordered. Elias staggered to his feet, still bleeding. Rhett hoisted him into the saddle of one of the abandoned horses and tied his feet to the stirrups. Then Rhett turned to Leora. "You sure about this?" She nodded. "I'm sure." "Then let's go finish it." They rode southeast through the fading afternoon light, 3 souls bound together by blood and justice, heading toward Larkspur County and the reckoning waiting there. The wound in Elias's shoulder bled steadily as they rode, leaving a dark trail down his coat that caught the last rays of sunlight. He sat slumped in the saddle, his face gray with pain and fury, his bound hands twisted behind him. Every few miles he would try to speak, to plead, to threaten, to bargain, but Rhett would silence him with a single sharp look, and the words would die in his throat. Leora rode beside Rhett, the tin box secured once more to her saddle. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at the man who had tried to destroy her. But she could feel his presence like a weight pressing against her back, heavy and suffocating. Part of her still couldn't believe he was really there, captured, powerless. Another part of her waited for him to break free, to rise up like some demon from a nightmare and drag her back into the flames. But he didn't. He just bled and rode in silence. They made camp that night in a narrow canyon, sheltered from the wind by high rock walls. Rhett built a small fire, just enough to boil coffee and warm their hands. He tied Elias to a cottonwood tree at the edge of the firelight, checking the knots twice. "You should eat," Rhett said to Leora, handing her a tin plate with hardtack and beans. She took it, but didn't touch the food. Her stomach was twisted into knots. "I can't." "You need your strength." "I know." She set the plate down beside her. I keep thinking about what happens next when we get to Larkspur County. What if the judge doesn't listen? What if Elias is right and no one believes me?" Rhett poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "Then we make them listen. We've got the letters. We've got him. That's more than most people get." "But what if it's not enough?" He was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Then he said, "My sister's name was Mary. She was 19 when she died. For years after, I asked myself the same question you're asking now. What if I'd spoken up? What if I'd done something? What if it wasn't enough?" He looked up at her. "The answer is, you do it anyway. You fight anyway. Because not fighting is worse than failing." Leora felt tears burning in her eyes. "I'm scared." "I know, but you're still moving forward. That's what matters." From the darkness at the edge of camp, Elias's voice drifted toward them, weak but venomous. "How touching. The crippled woman and her white knight. Do you really think this ends well for either of you? They'll tear you apart in that courtroom, Leora. They'll call you a liar, a lunatic, a whore. And when it's over, when you've humiliated yourself in front of the entire county, they'll send you to an asylum and hang your friend here for kidnapping a man of God." Rhett stood and crossed to where Elias sat bound against the tree. He crouched down, his face level with the preacher's. "You talk a lot for a man with a bullet hole in his shoulder. Next time you open your mouth, I'll gag you with your own belt. Understood?" Elias stared at him with hatred burning in his eyes, but he said nothing more. Rhett returned to the fire and sat down. "Try to sleep. We've got a long day tomorrow." Leora wrapped herself in her blanket and lay down near the fire's warmth, but sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the locked room, smelled the kerosene, heard the scrape of the match. She saw the faces of the girls whose letters she carried. Some she'd known, most she hadn't. 17 voices crying out for justice. 17 lives shattered by the man tied to the tree behind her. She wouldn't let them be silenced. Not again. They reached the outskirts of Larkspur County late the following afternoon. The land had changed as they traveled, flatter now, with wide stretches of grassland broken by clusters of timber and the occasional ranch house. The town of Larkspur itself sat in a shallow valley, a collection of wooden buildings and dirt streets that looked like 100 other frontier towns Leora had seen. But it wasn't the town that mattered. It was what it represented. Law. Order. The possibility of justice. They rode straight to the courthouse, a 2-story brick building that dominated the center of the town square. A handful of people stopped to stare as they passed. 3 riders, one of them clearly a prisoner, the woman with her face half hidden by a shawl. Whispers followed them like smoke. Rhett dismounted first, then helped Leora down. He untied Elias from the saddle and half dragged, half walked him up the courthouse steps. The preacher stumbled, his wounded shoulder making him unsteady, but Rhett's grip was iron. Inside, the courthouse was dim and smelled of old wood and ink. A clerk sat at a desk near the entrance, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening at the sight of the bloodied prisoner. "We need to see Judge Weatherby," Rhett said. The clerk stood quickly, flustered. "The judge he's in session right now. You can't just—" "This is urgent. Tell him Rhett Calder is here with a prisoner and evidence of a crime. He'll see us." The clerk hesitated, then nodded and disappeared through a side door. They waited in tense silence. Elias swayed on his feet, his face pale and slick with sweat. Leora stood close to Rhett, her hand clutching the tin box. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again, and the clerk reappeared. "Judge Weatherby will see you in his chambers, this way." They followed him down a narrow hallway and into a wood-paneled office. Behind a massive oak desk sat Judge Horace Weatherby, a man in his 70s with a shock of white hair and eyes like chips of flint. He looked up as they entered, his gaze sweeping over them with sharp, assessing intelligence. "Calder," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Didn't expect to see you again." "What's this about?" Rhett pushed Elias forward into a chair. "This man is Reverend Elias Brock from Shepherd's Bend. He's accused of arson, attempted murder, and assault on multiple women over a period of 8 years. We've got evidence and a witness." Judge Weatherby's eyes moved to Leora. "You the witness?" "Yes, sir." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "And you are?" "Leora Vance. I was his wife." The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "Was?" "I left him after he tried to kill me." Weatherby's gaze flicked to the shawl covering her face, and understanding passed across his features. "Show me." Leora hesitated, then slowly pulled the shawl back. The scarred tissue on the left side of her face was exposed, raw, puckered skin that had healed badly, twisting from her temple down to her jaw. The judge didn't flinch. He just looked, his expression unreadable. "How'd it happen?" "He locked me in a room and set it on fire." "Why?" Leora lifted the tin box. "Because I found these." She set the box on the desk and opened it. The letters spilled out, a cascade of paper and pain. Weatherby picked up one, then another, reading in silence. His face grew darker with each page. Finally, he set the letters down and looked at Elias. "You got anything to say?" Elias straightened in his chair, his voice regaining some of its old authority despite his weakened state. "Your Honor, I am a victim here, not a criminal. This woman is my wife. She suffers from delusions, hysteria. She attacked me, and this man," he nodded toward Rhett, "kidnapped me and brought me here under duress. I demand to be released and to see a doctor immediately." "You'll see a doctor when I say so," Weatherby snapped. "Right now, you'll sit there and keep your mouth shut." He turned back to Leora. "These letters, how'd you come by them?" "I found them hidden in his study. He kept them locked in a drawer. I think he wanted to remember, to keep proof of what he'd done." "And the girls who wrote them, where are they now?" "I don't know. Some of them left town, some of them—" Her voice broke. "Some of them didn't survive." Weatherby was silent for a long moment. Then he stood. "All right, here's what's going to happen. Reverend Brock, you're under arrest pending trial. You'll be held in the county jail and seen by a doctor for that shoulder wound. Mrs. Vance, you'll need to give a full statement to my clerk. Mr. Calder, you'll do the same. I'm setting a preliminary hearing for 3 days from now. In the meantime, I'm issuing a summons for anyone connected to these letters to come forward and testify. If even half of what's in here is true, you're looking at a hanging, Reverend." Elias surged to his feet. "This is an outrage. I am a man of God. I have rights." "Sit down," Weatherby said coldly, "or I'll have you dragged to your cell." 2 deputies appeared in the doorway, and Rhett handed Elias over to them. The preacher's eyes locked on Leora as they led him away, and she saw something in them that chilled her to the bone. Not fear, not remorse, just cold, calculating hatred. "He'll fight this," she said quietly after he was gone. "He'll bring witnesses, people who'll swear he's a good man." "Let him try," Weatherby said. "I've seen enough liars in my courtroom to know one when I see him. You just make sure you tell the truth, the whole truth. Can you do that?" Leora met his eyes. "Yes, sir." "Good. Now get out of here and get some rest. You look like death warmed over." News of the arrest spread through Larkspur County like wildfire. By the next morning, the town was buzzing with rumors and speculation. Some people were outraged, insisting that a man of the cloth could never commit such crimes. Others were curious, hungry for scandal. And a few, a precious few, were quietly hopeful that justice might finally be served. Rhett found them a room at a modest boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway. She was a stout woman with kind eyes who asked no questions when she saw Leora's face, just showed them to a clean room with 2 beds and brought them hot soup and fresh bread. "You'll be safe here," she said. "I don't tolerate trouble." Over the next 2 days, Leora gave her statement to the court clerk, recounting every detail of her marriage to Elias, every moment of cruelty, every lie. It was exhausting, like peeling back layers of scar tissue to expose wounds that had never properly healed. But she forced herself through it, knowing that this was her only chance. Rhett stayed close, a constant, steady presence. He didn't hover, didn't coddle her, but he was always there when she needed him. And slowly, impossibly, Leora began to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Not just safety, but strength. The preliminary hearing arrived too quickly, and not quickly enough. The courtroom was packed with spectators, curious townspeople, and journalists who'd traveled from surrounding counties to witness the spectacle. Leora sat at the front with Rhett beside her, her hands folded in her lap, the tin box resting on the table in front of her. Elias was brought in wearing clean clothes and bandages, his wounded shoulder in a sling. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than he had before, but his eyes still burned with defiant pride. His attorney was a slick-talking man named Horatio Finch, known for getting guilty men off on technicalities. Judge Weatherby entered, and the room fell silent. He took his seat and surveyed the crowd with a stern expression. "This is a preliminary hearing, not a circus. Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed. Is that clear?" Murmurs of assent rippled through the room. "Prosecution, present your case." The county prosecutor, a graying man named Samuel Harding, stood. "Your Honor, the territory charges Reverend Elias Brock with attempted murder, aggravated assault, and multiple counts of assault and coercion spanning 8 years. We have physical evidence in the form of letters written by the victims, as well as testimony from Mrs. Leora Vance, the defendant's wife and primary victim." Finch rose smoothly. "Your Honor, the defense moves for immediate dismissal. Mrs. Vance is a mentally unstable woman with a known history of hysteria. Her accusations are baseless, and the so-called evidence is nothing more than forgeries designed to slander my client's good name." "Motion denied," Weatherby said flatly. "Sit down, Mr. Finch. We'll hear the evidence." Harding called Leora to the stand. She walked to the witness box on trembling legs, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The bailiff swore her in, and she sat down, gripping the edge of the chair. "Mrs. Vance," Harding began gently, "please tell the court about your marriage to the defendant." She took a shaking breath, and then she began to speak. She told them everything. The courtship that had seemed like a blessing, the wedding that had felt like salvation, and then, slowly, the shift. The way Elias had isolated her, controlled her, made her feel like she was nothing without him. The girls who came to the church seeking help, seeking guidance, and how they would leave broken and silent. The night she found the letters, the locked room, the kerosene, the fire. Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop. She showed them her scars, not just on her face, but on her arms where the glass had cut her, where the flames had licked at her skin. She told them about the weeks she spent hiding, running, terrified that he would find her and finish what he'd started. By the time she finished, there were tears on the faces of several spectators. Even Weatherby's stern expression had softened slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," Harding said quietly. "Your witness, Mr. Finch?" Finch approached with a patronizing smile. "Mrs. Vance, isn't it true that you suffer from female hysteria?" "No." "Isn't it true that you've been treated for nervous disorders?" "No." "Isn't it true that you resented your husband's devotion to his congregation and sought to destroy him out of jealousy?" "No." Her voice was stronger now. "None of that is true." "Then explain to the court why, if your husband was such a monster, you never reported him to the authorities in Shepherd's Bend." "I tried," Leora said, her eyes blazing. "I went to the sheriff. I went to the town council. No one would listen. They all said the same thing you're saying now, that I was hysterical, that I was lying, because he's a preacher and I'm just a woman." Finch opened his mouth to respond, but Weatherby cut him off. "Move on, counselor." The examination continued, brutal and degrading, but Leora held her ground. She refused to be broken again. Finally, Finch returned to his seat, and Harding stood once more. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls its next witness, Miss Emma Hartley." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Leora's head snapped up. She didn't know that name, didn't recognize the young woman who stood from the back of the room and walked slowly to the witness stand. Emma Hartley was no more than 20, with dark hair and frightened eyes. She was sworn in, and when Harding asked her to state her name for the record, her voice was barely audible. "I'm Emma Hartley. I'm from Shepherd's Bend. Miss Hartley, do you know the defendant, Reverend Elias Brock? Yes. Her voice broke. I know him. Can you tell the court about your interaction with him? Emma's hands twisted in her lap. 2 years ago, my father died. I went to Reverend Brock for comfort, for guidance. He told me he would help me. Tears streamed down her face. But he didn't help me. He hurt me. And when I tried to tell people, no one believed me. They said I was trying to trap him, to ruin him, so I stayed quiet. I buried it. Until I heard that someone was finally standing up to him. The courtroom erupted. Finch was on his feet, shouting objections, but Weatherby slammed his gavel down. Order! Order in this court! Harding's voice rang out above the chaos. Your Honor, we have 2 more witnesses who wish to testify. Miss Sarah Brennan and Miss Catherine Doyle, both from Shepherd's Bend, both with similar accounts. One by one, they came forward. 3 women who had been silent for years, carrying shame and pain that wasn't theirs to carry. 3 women who looked at Leora and saw their own courage reflected back. By the time the last witness finished, Elias's face was ashen. Finch was scrambling, objecting to everything, but it was too late. The truth had been spoken, and it couldn't be taken back. Judge Weatherby called a recess, and the courtroom emptied slowly. Leora sat in her chair, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. Rhett touched her shoulder gently. You did it. We did it, she whispered. All of us. But even as relief flooded through her, she knew the fight wasn't over. Elias was still alive, still dangerous, and men like him didn't go down without taking others with them. The trial resumed the next day, and this time the atmosphere was different. The spectators were quieter, more somber. The weight of the testimony hung heavy in the air. Finch put on a vigorous defense, calling character witnesses from Shepherd's Bend who swore that Elias was a pillar of the community, a man of unwavering faith and integrity. But their words rang hollow against the testimony of the women who had suffered. On the 3rd day, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict in a clear, steady voice. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charges of aggravated assault, guilty. On all counts of assault and coercion, guilty. The courtroom exploded with sound, some cheering, some weeping, some shouting in outrage. Weatherby slammed his gavel repeatedly until order was restored. He looked at Elias, who sat frozen in his chair, and his voice was hard as granite. Reverend Elias Brock, you have been found guilty of heinous crimes against innocent women. You used your position of trust to prey upon the vulnerable, and you attempted to murder your own wife to cover your sins. This court sentences you to death by hanging, to be carried out 1 week from today. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court will not. Elias's face twisted with rage. He lunged to his feet, shouting, This is a mockery, a travesty. You'll all burn for this, every last one of you. The deputies seized him, dragging him from the courtroom as he screamed threats and curses. His voice echoed down the hallway until a door slammed shut, cutting off the sound. Leora sat perfectly still. She felt Rhett's hand on her shoulder, felt the eyes of the courtroom on her, but all she could think was, It's over. It's finally over. But it wasn't. Not yet. That night, as Leora and Rhett returned to the boarding house, they found Mrs. Calloway waiting for them on the porch, her face pale. There were men here, she said, 3 of them. They asked for you by name, said they had a message. What message? Rhett asked, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. Mrs. Calloway handed him a folded piece of paper. Rhett opened it, his jaw tightening as he read. What is it? Leora asked. He handed her the note. The words were written in crude, angry script. You took our preacher. We'll take everything you love. This ain't over. Leora's blood ran cold. Elias's followers. More than likely. Rhett crumpled the note. Pack your things. We're not staying here tonight. Where will we go? The jail. I'll talk to the sheriff, see if he can spare a deputy to keep watch, at least until after the hanging. They gathered their belongings quickly and made their way through the dark streets to the county jail. The sheriff, a burly man named Tom Bridger, listened to their story and agreed to post a guard. A lot of folks in this county didn't take kindly to the verdict, he admitted. Brock's got friends, dangerous ones. You two watch yourselves." They spent the night in a small room adjacent to the jail, taking turns keeping watch. Leora barely slept, every sound making her jump. She kept expecting the door to burst open, expecting masked men to drag them out into the street. But morning came, and they were still alive. The days leading up to the execution were tense. Threats continued to arrive, notes slipped under doors, whispered warnings in the street. Someone threw a rock through the window of the courthouse. Another set fire to a hay wagon outside the jail, though it was quickly extinguished. Judge Weatherby refused to be intimidated. "The law has spoken," he declared publicly. "Justice will be served." On the morning of the execution, the town square was packed. Hundreds of people had come to witness the hanging, some out of morbid curiosity, some to see justice done, some hoping for violence. Leora stood with Rhett at the edge of the crowd, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. The gallows had been erected in the center of the square, a grim wooden structure that cast long shadows in the early morning light. Elias was led out in chains, flanked by deputies. His face was calm now, composed. He looked out at the crowd as if he were about to deliver a sermon, and for a moment Leora saw the man she had once thought she loved. The man who had spoken of mercy and grace and salvation, but that man had never existed. He was just a mask, and the monster had always been underneath. The sheriff read the charges and the sentence. A priest offered final prayers, but Elias refused them. "I have nothing to repent for," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "I served God faithfully. History will remember me as a martyr, and you," he looked directly at Leora, "you will burn for what you've done." The hood was placed over his head. The noose tightened around his neck. Judge Weatherby gave the signal. The trapdoor opened. Elias Brock dropped, and the rope went taut with a sickening snap. His body jerked once, twice, then hung still. Leora watched without flinching. She didn't feel joy, didn't feel satisfaction. She just felt empty, like something that had been lodged inside her chest for years had finally been removed, leaving a hollow space behind. "It's done," Rhett said quietly beside her. She nodded. "It's done." But even as they turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. That somewhere in the crowd, Elias's followers were watching, waiting, planning their revenge. And she was right. That night, Rhett's barn burned. They saw the orange glow against the night sky long before they reached Rhett's property. The flames rose high and angry, devouring the barn with a hunger that seemed almost alive, casting writhing shadows across the land. Leora's heart seized in her chest as they pushed their horses harder, the animals sensing their rider's urgency. By the time they arrived, half the structure had collapsed. The heat was immense even from 50 yards away, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning hay and timber. Rhett's 2 horses, the ones he'd left behind, were nowhere to be seen. Either they'd escaped or they'd been taken. The chicken coop was untouched, the birds clucking nervously in the darkness, but the barn was beyond saving. Rhett dismounted and stood perfectly still, watching his livelihood burn. His face was illuminated by the firelight, hard and unreadable. Leora slid down from her horse and came to stand beside him, her hand finding his arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He didn't respond immediately, just watched the flames consume what he'd built. Finally he said, "They wanted to send a message. They succeeded." "No." His voice was flat, controlled. "A message would have been the cabin. This was meant to hurt me, slow us down. But it also tells me they're not done." As if in answer to his words, a figure emerged from the darkness at the edge of the property. Then another, and another. 5 men in total, their faces hidden by bandanas, rifles held loosely in their hands. They stood just beyond the firelight, watching. Rhett's hand moved to his gun, but Leora gripped his arm tighter. "There are too many." "I know." One of the men stepped forward, close enough that they could see his eyes, cold and empty. When he spoke, his voice was muffled by the bandana but still clear enough to understand. "You should have minded your own business, Calder. That preacher was a good man. What happened to him was murder, plain and simple." "What happened to him was justice," Rhett said evenly. "He got a fair trial and a legal sentence, more than he gave the women he hurt. You believe what you want, but you crossed the wrong people. This he gestured to the burning barn, is just the beginning. You and that whore you're protecting, you're both marked. Might be tonight, might be next week, might be next month. But you'll pay. Count on it. Then come on and try, Rhett said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. I'm right here. The man laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Oh, we'll come. But not like you expect. Men like you always think they can stand and fight. But we don't fight fair. His eyes shifted to Leora. How's it feel, woman? Knowing you burned a man of God? Knowing you're damned for all eternity? Leora's throat was tight, but she forced herself to speak. He was no man of God. And if telling the truth damns me, then I'll burn gladly. The man spat in the dirt. You'll burn all right, just like he did. He jerked his head toward the others. Let's go, we made our point. They melted back into the darkness as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving only the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance and the roar of the flames. Rhett and Leora stood in silence until the fire began to die down, the barn reduced to a skeleton of charred timber and ash. There was nothing to be done, nothing to save. When the last flames guttered out and only smoke remained, Rhett turned toward the cabin. Come on, we need to pack what we can carry and leave before sunrise. Leave? But this is your home. Home's wherever you make it. He looked at her, and in the dying light she saw something fierce and protective in his eyes. And I can't protect you here. Not anymore. They worked quickly and quietly, gathering supplies by lamplight. Clothes, food, ammunition, the few valuables Rhett owned, everything fit into 2 saddlebags and a bedroll. It wasn't much, but it was enough to survive. As Leora packed the last of the dried meat, she noticed Rhett standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. What is it? Just thinking. Those men, they knew we'd come back here. They were waiting, which means they've been watching us. Probably have been since the trial started. So where can we go that they won't find us? Rhett was quiet for a moment, then moved to the table and unrolled a map he kept in a drawer. He traced a line southeast with his finger. Cedar Ridge, about 80 miles from here, across the territorial line. It's small, isolated. I know a man there, owns a ranch. He'd take us in, no questions asked. 80 miles through open country with men hunting us. I didn't say it would be easy. He looked at her. But staying here means dying, and I'm not ready to die. Are you? She thought of the courtroom, of the 3 women who had stood beside her and spoken their truth. She thought of the tin box and the 17 voices it carried. She thought of Elias swinging from the gallows and the emptiness she'd felt watching him die. No, she wasn't ready to die. Not when there was still so much to live for. No, she said, I'm not ready. Then we leave now, while it's still dark. The moon's nearly full. We'll have enough light to travel by. They saddled the horses in tense silence, checking the cinches twice, loading the saddlebags with care. Rhett took one last look at the cabin, at the land he'd worked for years to claim as his own, and then he swung into the saddle. Don't look back, he said quietly. Leora understood. Looking back meant mourning what was lost. Looking forward meant surviving. They rode into the darkness, leaving the smoldering ruins behind. The journey to Cedar Ridge was 3 days of constant vigilance. They traveled mostly at night, sleeping in hidden ravines and cave outcroppings during the day. Rhett taught Leora how to cover their tracks, how to read the land for signs of pursuit, how to sleep lightly with one hand on a weapon. She learned quickly, driven by necessity and fear. On the second night, they spotted riders in the distance, 3 of them, moving parallel to their route. Rhett and Leora waited in a dry creek bed for 2 hours, barely breathing until the riders passed. They never knew if it was Elias's men or just travelers, but they didn't take chances. By the 3rd day, exhaustion was setting in. Leora's body ached from riding, her eyes burned from lack of sleep, and every sound made her jump. But they kept moving, driven by Rhett's quiet determination and the knowledge that stopping meant death. They crossed the territorial line just before dawn on the 4th day. The landscape here was different, greener, with more timber and rolling hills. There was a freshness to the air that felt like hope. Almost there, Rhett said, his voice rough from disuse. Another few hours. Cedar Ridge appeared in the late morning, a scattering of buildings nestled in a valley between pine-covered slopes. It was smaller than Larkspur, maybe 40 or 50 residents total, with a general store, a church, a blacksmith, and not much else. But it was quiet, peaceful, and far enough from Larkspur County that Elias's followers would have a hard time tracking them. Rhett led them to a ranch at the edge of town, a modest spread with grazing cattle and a sturdy log house. A man was working in the corral, mending fence posts. He looked up as they approached, squinting against the sun. Then recognition dawned on his weathered face. Rhett called her. "Well, I'll be damned." Rhett dismounted and clasped the man's hand. Jack Brennan was in his 50s, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He looked at Leora with curiosity but no judgment. "Who's your friend?" "This is Leora. She's had some trouble. We both have. I was hoping we could stay here for a while, work for our keep." Jack studied them for a long moment, taking in their exhausted faces, their travel-worn clothes, the wariness in their eyes. Then he nodded. "Barn needs repairs. Fences could use mending. I can give you a cabin out back and 3 meals a day. Fair?" "More than fair," Rhett said quietly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. You'll earn every bit of it." He gestured toward a small cabin visible beyond the main house. "Get yourselves settled. We'll talk details over supper." The cabin was simple but clean, one room with a stove, a table, 2 beds, and a fireplace. After weeks of running and hiding, it felt like a palace. Leora sank onto one of the beds and nearly wept with relief. Rhett set their bags down and moved to the window, scanning the landscape out of habit. "We should be safe here, at least for a while." "And after a while?" "We see how things stand. If Elias's men give up, we stay. If they keep hunting, we move again." He turned to look at her. "I know this isn't the life you imagined." "I stopped imagining anything a long time ago," Leora said softly. "Now I just try to survive." Maybe it's time to start imagining again. She wanted to believe him, but hope was a dangerous thing, and she'd been burned by it before. Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Rhett worked alongside Jack, repairing buildings and mending fences. Leora helped Jack's wife, Martha, with household tasks, cooking, preserving food, tending the garden. It was hard work, but it was honest work. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Leora felt useful. Martha was a sturdy woman in her 40s with a warm smile and hands roughened by decades of labor. She never asked about Leora's scars or her past, just accepted her presence with quiet grace. Sometimes in the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, shelling peas or mending clothes, and Martha would tell stories about the early days of the ranch, about the hardships and small victories that had shaped her life. "Life out here isn't easy," Martha said one evening, her fingers working steadily. "But it's ours. We built it with our own hands, and nobody can take that away." Leora thought about Rhett's cabin, about the barn burning, about everything she'd lost. What if they try? Martha looked at her, her eyes sharp and knowing. "Then you fight, and if you can't fight, you rebuild. That's all any of us can do." It was simple wisdom, but it settled something in Leora's chest. She was tired of running, tired of being afraid. Maybe it was time to stand still, to put down roots, even if they were shallow ones. But peace, she was learning, was a fragile thing. The trouble started small. A man came through Cedar Ridge asking questions about newcomers to the area. The storekeeper mentioned it to Jack, who mentioned it to Rhett. They kept a low profile for a few days, and the man moved on. Then a week later, another stranger appeared, this one claiming to be a journalist writing about the Brock trial. He interviewed several townspeople, asking if they'd seen a scarred woman or a cowboy matching Rhett's description. The sheriff of Cedar Ridge, a no-nonsense man named Tom Jessup, came to the ranch to give them a warning. "I don't know what trouble you two are running from, and I don't much care, but if it follows you here and puts my town at risk, we're going to have a problem." "Understood," Rhett said. "We don't want trouble any more than you do." "See that you don't bring it." Jessup tipped his hat and rode off. That night, Leora couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to Rhett's steady breathing from the other bed, and thought about the journalists, the questions, the men who'd burned Rhett's barn. They were still out of there, still hunting, and sooner or later they would find her. She rose quietly and slipped outside. The night air was cool and clean, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant call of an owl. She walked to the edge of the property and stood looking up at the stars, so numerous they seemed to spill across the sky like scattered diamonds. Can't sleep? She turned to find Rhett standing behind her, his coat pulled over his nightshirt. I didn't mean to wake you. You didn't. I was already awake. He came to stand beside her, following her gaze upward. Lot of stars out tonight. Too many to count. They stood in companionable silence for a while. Then Rhett said, You're thinking about leaving. It wasn't a question. Leora didn't deny it. I keep thinking, maybe if I left, if I went somewhere far away, they'd stop looking, and you could go back to having a normal life. I don't want a normal life if it means abandoning you. His words were simple, direct, and they hit her with unexpected force. She turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw in his weathered face a devotion that had nothing to do with pity or obligation. It was something deeper, something she didn't have a name for. Why? She whispered. Why do you care so much? Rhett was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Because you remind me of Mary, not in looks or manner, but in strength. My sister, she didn't have a choice. Nobody helped her, and she died thinking she deserved what happened to her. But you fought back, you survived, and I'll be damned if I let those bastards take that away from you. Leora felt tears burning in her eyes. I'm not as strong as you think. You're stronger. He reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. And you're not alone. Remember that. She held onto his hand like a lifeline, and for the first time in months, the weight on her chest eased just a little. But the respite didn't last. 3 days later, word came that 2 men had been seen camping in the hills outside Cedar Ridge. They matched the description of men who'd been asking questions in Larkspur County. Jack offered to lend Rhett his rifle and ride out with him to investigate, but Rhett refused. This is my fight, he said. I won't put you and Martha at risk. You're on my land, so it's my fight too, Jack countered. Besides, 2 guns are better than 1. In the end, Rhett agreed, and the 2 men rode out together at first light. Leora waited at the ranch with Martha, her nerves stretched tight as wire. Every minute felt like an hour. Martha tried to distract her with work, but Leora's hand shook too much to be useful. It was late afternoon when Rhett and Jack returned. Both men were unharmed, but their expressions were grim. Well? Martha demanded. Found their camp, Jack said, dismounting heavily. They cleared out sometime this morning. Left a message, though. Rhett handed Leora a piece of paper. The words were written in the same crude script as the note in Larkspur. We know you're here. We're coming. Leora's hands began to shake. When? Could be days, could be hours. Rhett's jaw was tight. But they're done playing games. Next time they come, they'll come in force. Martha's face was pale but determined. Then we prepare. Jack, get the rifles. Leora, help me board up the windows. If they want to fight, we'll give them one. They worked through the evening, fortifying the cabin and the main house, checking ammunition, planning escape routes. Sheriff Jessup was summoned, and he arrived with 2 deputies, all 3 men armed and serious. I sent word to the territorial marshal, Jessup said, but he's 3 days away at best. We're on our own until then. How many men do you think they'll bring? Jack asked. Hard to say. Could be 6, could be a dozen. Men like this, they're cowards at heart. They like overwhelming odds. Night fell and they took turns keeping watch. Leora sat in the cabin with a rifle across her lap, her heart pounding with every sound. Rhett was on the porch, his own weapon ready. Jack and the sheriff were positioned at strategic points around the property. The attack came just before dawn. They heard the riders before they saw them, a thunder of hoofbeats in the pre-dawn darkness. 7 men, maybe 8, silhouettes against the lightening sky. They came fast and hard, firing as they rode, bullets slamming into the walls and shattering windows. Stay down! Rhett shouted, returning fire. The cabin erupted in chaos. Leora dropped to the floor, her ears ringing from the gunfire. She could hear men shouting outside, horses screaming, the sharp crack of rifles. She crawled to the window and peered out, her hand shaking as she raised her own weapon. One of the riders was circling toward the back of the cabin. She aimed carefully, remembering what Rhett had taught her, and fired. The man jerked in his saddle and fell, and Leora felt a surge of fierce satisfaction mixed with horror. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When the shooting finally stopped, 3 of the attackers lay dead or wounded in the yard. The others had fled, disappearing into the hills like ghosts. Sheriff Jessup and his deputies began checking the bodies while Jack tended to a graze wound on his arm. Rhett came into the cabin, his face streaked with powder burns, and pulled Leora into his arms without a word. She clung to him, shaking. "Is it over?" "For now." One of the wounded men was still conscious, groaning in pain. Jessup crouched beside him. "Who sent you?" The man spat blood. "Go to hell." "You first. But before you go, you might want to think about whether dying for a dead preacher is worth it." The man's eyes flickered with something. Doubt, maybe, or fear. "Wasn't about the preacher." "Not really." "Then what was it about?" "Money. Some rich bastard in Shepherd's Bend put up a bounty. $500 for the woman, dead or alive. We were just trying to collect." Leora's blood ran cold. "Who? Who put up the bounty?" The man coughed, more blood bubbling from his lips. "Don't know his name, just a deacon from Brock's church." His eyes rolled back and he went still. Jessup stood slowly, his face dark. "Deacon. That narrows it down to about 6 men in Shepherd's Bend." "Can you arrest them?" Leora asked. "On what evidence? A dying man's word, they'd be out in a day." He shook his head. "But I can make it known that Cedar Ridge is under my protection. Anyone comes here looking for trouble, they'll answer to me and the territorial marshal both. That might slow them down." "Might," Rhett echoed, "but it won't stop them." Leora looked at the bodies in the yard, at the bullet holes in the cabin walls, at the blood soaking into the earth. This was her life now. Running, fighting, watching people die because of her. And she was so tired of it. "I'm going to Shepherd's Bend," she said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at her. "What?" Rhett said. "I'm going back. I'm going to find out who put up the bounty, and I'm going to end this, once and for all." "That's suicide," Jack said flatly. "Maybe, but staying here, waiting for them to keep coming, that's not living. That's just dying slowly." She looked at Rhett. "I testified in court. I watched Elias hang, but it's not enough. His followers are still out there, still spreading his poison. I need to cut it out at the root." Rhett's face was a mask of conflicting emotions. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" "I don't know yet, but I have the letters. I have the truth, and I have witnesses who will back me up. The newspapers publish some of the trial testimony, but not all of it. If I can get the full story out, if I can expose everyone who helped Elias or profited from his crimes, maybe, just maybe, I can make it so dangerous to come after me that they'll stop." It was a desperate plan, maybe even a foolish one, but it was the only plan she had. Sheriff Jessup studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You've got grit, I'll give you that. And you might be right. Sunlight's the best disinfectant. Expose these bastards to the public, let them face the consequences, and the bounty becomes worthless." He paused. "But you can't go alone." "I'll go with her," Rhett said immediately. "And I'll send a deputy," Jessup added. "Someone to make it official, keep things legal. You go in there with a badge backing you. It's harder for them to make you disappear." Leora felt overwhelmed by their support, by the fact that these people, most of whom had known her for mere weeks, were willing to risk their lives for her. "Thank you, all of you." Martha came forward and squeezed her hand. "You bring down those who deserve it, girl. Make them pay for every tear, every scar, and then you come back here and build yourself a real life." Leora nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Jessup's deputy, a young man named Will Carter, was briefed on the situation and given authority to make arrests if necessary. Rhett cleaned and loaded weapons. Leora went through the tin box one more time, organizing the letters, making notes of names and dates that might be useful. As evening fell, Martha pulled her aside. "You know this might not work." "I know." "And you know they might kill you." "I know that too." Martha's eyes were fierce. "Then make sure you don't die for nothing. Make sure every word you speak is the truth. loud and clear, so even if they silence you, the echo will remain." "I will," Leora promised. That night, she sat with Rhett on the porch one last time. The stars were out again, brilliant and indifferent. Somewhere out there, men were plotting her death. But here, in this moment, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. She felt ready. "You don't have to do this," Rhett said quietly. "Yes, I do. For Emma and Sarah and Catherine. For the 17 girls in those letters. For every woman who's ever been hurt by a man who thought his position made him untouchable." She looked at him. "And for myself. I need to know I didn't just survive. I need to know I won." Rhett reached out and took her hand. "Then we'll make sure you win." They rode out at dawn, 3 riders heading back toward the place where it all began. Leora didn't know what awaited them in Shepherd's Bend. She didn't know if justice would prevail or if she'd end up in an unmarked grave. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was done running. Whatever came next, she would face it standing upright, with the truth as her weapon and the strength of those who believed in her as her shield. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Leora Vance believed she could win it. The road to Shepherd's Bend stretched before them like a scar across the landscape, dusty and unforgiving under the relentless sun. Leora rode between Rhett and Deputy Will Carter, her spine straight despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones. The tin box was secured in her saddlebag, its weight a constant reminder of why they were making this journey. Every mile brought them closer to the town that had cast her out, the place where her nightmare had begun. Will Carter was younger than she'd expected, maybe 25, with an honest face and nervous hands that kept checking his rifle. This was likely his first real assignment beyond settling disputes over property lines and drunk cowboys. But Sheriff Jessup had chosen him for a reason. He was untainted by the politics of Shepherd's Bend, unbeholden to anyone but the law. "How far now?" Will asked as they crested a hill. "Another 10 miles, Rhett said, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. "We should reach the outskirts by sundown." Leora's stomach tightened. Sundown meant facing the town in darkness, meant seeing the church where Elias had preached his lies, the house where he'd tried to burn her alive. Part of her wanted to turn the horse around, to run back to the safety of Cedar Ridge and forget this foolish plan. But she'd come too far, lost too much, to turn back now. "When we get there," Will said, "we go straight to the sheriff's office, official business. We present the evidence, file formal charges against anyone connected to the bounty, and let the law handle it." "The sheriff's in Brock's pocket," Leora said quietly. "Half the town is. They won't want to hear what we have to say." "Then we make them hear it." Will's voice was steadier than his hands. "I've got a badge from the territorial authority. They can't just ignore that." Rhett's expression suggested he wasn't so sure, but he didn't argue. They rode on in tense silence, the sun sliding lower toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. Shepherd's Bend appeared just as Leora remembered it, a modest town of wooden buildings and false-fronted shops, with the church rising on its hill like a judgmental finger pointing at heaven. The streets were quieter than usual, the Sunday service likely just ended, families gathering for supper. Normal life, unchanged, as if a monster hadn't lived among them, as if 17 girls hadn't suffered in silence. They dismounted outside the sheriff's office, a squat building with barred windows and a hitching post out front. The sign above the door read, "Sheriff Marcus Webb," and Leora's hands began to shake. Webb had been one of Elias's staunchest defenders, had refused to even look at her evidence when she'd tried to report the abuse. "You ready?" Rhett asked quietly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Will went in first, his hand resting on his gun belt. Rhett and Leora followed. The office was dim and smelled of tobacco and old coffee. Sheriff Webb sat behind his desk, a thick-bodied man in his 50s with cold eyes and a jaw like granite. He looked up as they entered, and his expression hardened immediately when he saw Leora. "You got a lot of nerve coming back here," he said, not standing. "We're here on official business," Will said, stepping forward. "I'm Deputy Will Carter, representing the Territorial Marshal's office. We have evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving citizens of this town, and we're here to—" "I don't give a damn who you represent," Webb interrupted. "That woman is a liar and a murderer. She got Reverend Brock hanged on false testimony, and now she's back to spread more poison." The Reverend was convicted in a court of law, Will said firmly, by a jury of his peers. The evidence was overwhelming. Evidence can be fabricated. Testimony can be coerced. Webb stood now, his hand moving to his own gun. You three need to leave now. Rhett stepped forward, his voice deadly calm. We're not leaving until you do your job. There's a bounty on Leora's head put up by someone in this town. Men died trying to collect it. That makes this attempted murder, conspiracy, maybe even accessory to murder. You're going to investigate, or we're going to the territorial marshal, and you'll be investigated. Webb's face flushed dark red. You threatening me? Stating facts. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the air thick with tension. Then Webb laughed, a harsh sound without humor. You really think anyone in this town is going to help you? Reverend Brock was beloved here. He fed the hungry, married the young, buried the dead. And you, he pointed at Leora, you destroyed him with your lies. You think anyone's going to side with you over his memory? They will when they see the letters, Leora said, her voice stronger than she felt. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the tin box, setting it on Webb's desk with a sharp thud. 17 girls, 17 victims, all documented, all real. Webb stared at the box like it was a snake. Get that out of my office. Open it, Leora challenged. Read them. Look at the dates, the details, the names. Unless you're afraid of the truth. The truth, Webb spat, is that you're a disturbed woman who couldn't give her husband children, who went mad with grief and invented lies to excuse your own failings. The truth is that Reverend Brock is dead because of you, and there are people in this town who want justice. Justice? Leora's voice rose, all the fear and rage of the past months pouring out. You want to talk about justice? Where was justice when Emma Hartley came to you crying, telling you what Elias did to her? Where was justice when Sarah Brennan tried to report him and you called her a seductress? You didn't want justice, Sheriff. You wanted to protect your comfortable lie. Webb's hand twitched toward his gun, but Will was faster. The deputy had his weapon drawn and aimed before Webb could clear leather. Don't, Will said quietly. I will arrest you for threatening a witness and obstructing an investigation. Is that really how you want this to go? Webb's face was purple with fury, but he slowly raised his hands. You're making a mistake, all of you. The only mistake here is yours, Will said. Now sit down and listen, because we're going to file formal charges whether you cooperate or not. Slowly, Webb sank back into his chair. His eyes were full of hate, but he was listening. Rhett began laying out the evidence, the letters, the testimony from the trial, the attacks in Cedar Ridge, the dying man's confession about the bounty. Will took notes, his writing quick and precise, documenting everything for the official record. Leora stood silent, watching Webb's face as each piece of evidence was presented. She saw the moment his certainty began to crack, the moment doubt crept in. He didn't want to believe them, but the sheer weight of documentation was impossible to ignore. When they finished, Will set down his pen. Based on this evidence, I'm opening an investigation into several citizens of Shepherd's Bend, including Deacon Samuel Thorne, Deacon William Marsh, and potentially others. I'll need to interview witnesses and examine church financial records to determine who funded the bounty. Church records are private, Webb said weakly. Not when they're evidence of a crime. Will's voice was hard. You can cooperate, Sheriff, or I can ride back to the territorial capital and return with federal marshals. Your choice. Webb looked trapped, cornered. But before he could respond, the office door burst open. A man in his 60s stood in the doorway, well-dressed and prosperous-looking, with iron-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Leora recognized him immediately. Deacon Samuel Thorne, one of the wealthiest men in Shepherd's Bend and Elias's closest ally. Sheriff, I heard there was trouble. Thorne stopped when he saw Leora, his face draining of color. You, what are you doing here? Seeking justice, Leora said evenly. Something you know nothing about. Thorne's shock gave way to fury. You have no right to be here. You murdered a holy man, and now you dare return to pollute this town with your presence? I didn't murder anyone, Leora said. The law executed him for his crimes you helped cover up. That's a lie. Is it? Will stepped forward. Because we have evidence that suggests otherwise. Evidence of a bounty put on Mrs. Vance's life, funded by members of Reverend Brock's congregation. Evidence that 7 men were paid to kill her. 3 of them died in the attempt. That makes you and anyone else involved accessories to attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Thorne's face went from red to gray. I don't know what you're talking about. Then you won't mind if we examine the church financial records, Will said calmly. See where the money's been going. Those records are sealed. You have no authority. I have all the authority I need. Will pulled a folded document from his coat. Warrant signed by the territorial judge. I can search church property, seize financial documents, and compel testimony from church officials. So I'll ask you again, Deacon Thorne, do you know anything about a bounty on Mrs. Vance's life? The room fell silent. Thorne's hands were shaking, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. He looked at Webb, at Rhett, at Leora, and she saw the moment he realized he was caught. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Elias was a good man, a great man. He brought people to God, raised money for the poor. Yes, he had his weaknesses, his sins, but what man doesn't? What he did, those girls, they were temptations sent to test him. He struggled, he fell, but his work was still holy. His work, Leora said, her voice shaking with rage, was destroying innocent lives. He wasn't tested, he was a predator, and you enabled him. Thorne's eyes were desperate. You don't understand. When the trial happened, when the verdict came down, the church was in chaos. People were losing faith, questioning everything. I needed to restore order, to show that attacking a man of God had consequences. So yes, I put up money. $500 to anyone who could make you disappear. I thought it would send a message, protect the church's reputation. You put a price on my life, Leora said, to protect your pride. To protect God's work. Thorne's voice rose. The church is bigger than one man, bigger than one woman's accusations. If Elias was flawed, so be it, but the institution must survive. Will's face was hard as stone. Samuel Thorne, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder. You have the right to— You can't do this! Thorne backed toward the door. I'm a pillar of this community. I've donated thousands to civic causes. You can't just— Rhett moved faster than Leora had ever seen him move, blocking the door. You're not going anywhere. Thorne turned back to Webb, pleading, Marcus, please. We've known each other for 20 years. You know me. You know I'm not a criminal. Webb looked at him for a long moment, and Leora saw something shift in the sheriff's eyes. Maybe it was the weight of evidence. Maybe it was the realization that protecting Thorne meant going down with him. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a flicker of actual conscience. Whatever it was, when Webb spoke, his voice was resigned. I know you, Samuel, and I know what you did. He stood slowly. I'll testify to conversations we had about handling the Vance problem, about how you wanted her gone permanently. I won't go down for this alone. Thorne's face crumpled. You bastard! After everything I've done for you— Everything you've done has been for yourself, Webb said quietly. I'm done being part of it. Will handcuffed Thorne, reading him his rights, while the deacon alternated between rage and pleading. As they led him to the cell in the back of the building, Leora felt something release in her chest. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction, but something close to vindication. But the fight wasn't over yet. Word spread through Shepherd's Bend with the speed of wildfire. By morning, the whole town knew that Deacon Thorne had been arrested, that the church was being investigated, that Leora Vance had returned. Reactions were mixed. Some people were outraged, convinced this was further persecution of good Christian men. Others were beginning to question, to wonder if maybe the woman they'd scorned had been telling the truth all along. Will Carter, with Rhett and Leora at his side, spent the next 3 days conducting interviews and examining records. What they found was damning, not just the bounty money, but years of financial irregularities, donations that had been diverted to pay off families of Elias's victims, hush money that had bought silence and complicity. Deacon William Marsh was arrested on the second day. 2 other church officials fled town before they could be questioned, which was as good as a confession. But the real turning point came on the 4th day, when Will arranged for a public meeting at the town hall. He posted notices throughout Shepherd's Bend, stating that evidence regarding Reverend Brock's crimes and the subsequent conspiracy would be presented, and that all citizens were invited to attend. Leora was terrified. Standing in front of the entire town, exposing herself to their judgment again, it felt like walking back into the fire. But Rhett stood beside her, solid and unwavering, and she drew strength from his presence. The hall was packed, every seat was filled, people standing along the walls, more crowding in the doorway. Leora saw faces she recognized, shopkeepers and farmers, women she'd once considered friends, men who'd turned away when she'd begged for help. She saw Emma Hartley sitting near the front, her face pale but determined. Sarah Brennan was there too, and Catherine Doyle, the 3 women who'd testified at the trial. Will called the meeting to order, his young face grave. Thank you all for coming. What we discussed today is difficult, painful, but necessary. For too long this town has lived with a lie. For too long you've been told that Reverend Elias Brock was a victim, that Leora Vance was a disturbed woman who destroyed an innocent man. Today, I'm going to show you the truth. He spent the next hour laying out the evidence, reading excerpts from the letters, presenting financial records, documenting the bounty and the attacks it had spawned. He called Emma, Sarah, and Catherine to speak, and they did, their voices shaking but clear, telling their stories to the people who'd refused to believe them before. The mood in the room shifted like a tide turning. Leora watched faces change, shock giving way to horror, denial crumbling into guilty realization. Some people left, unable or unwilling to confront what they were hearing. But most stayed, and when Will finally asked if anyone else had information or testimony to share, 3 more women stood, then 5 more, then 8. By the time the sun set, 23 women had come forward. Not all of them had been directly victimized by Elias, but all of them had stories of being dismissed, silenced, shamed when they'd tried to speak up about abuse in the church or in the community. The tin box that had held 17 letters had become a symbol of something larger, a breaking of silence that had festered for too long. When the last woman finished speaking, the hall was silent. Then someone started clapping. It was an old woman Leora didn't recognize, her face lined with age and sorrow. Others joined in, slowly at first, then building to a wave of applause that wasn't celebratory but acknowledging, a recognition of courage, of truth told at great cost. Will stood. Based on the evidence presented and the testimony given, formal charges will be filed against Samuel Thorne, William Marsh, and others implicated in the conspiracy. The church will be placed under financial oversight pending a full audit, and I'm recommending that Sheriff Marcus Webb be removed from office for failure to uphold his duties and potential complicity in covering up crimes. Webb, who'd been sitting in the back, stood and walked out without a word. No one tried to stop him. After the meeting, as people filed out in subdued groups, Emma Hartley approached Leora. The younger woman's eyes were red-rimmed but fierce. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not giving up, for coming back." "Thank you for speaking," Leora replied, "for being brave." "I wasn't brave. Not until I saw you were." Emma glanced at the other women gathering nearby. "We're going to start a group. A place where women can talk about what happened to them, support each other. We want you to be part of it." Leora felt tears burning in her eyes. "I don't know if I'm staying in Shepherd's Bend." "Then visit when you can, but know that what you started here, it's going to continue. You changed this town. You changed us." Over the following weeks, the transformation in Shepherd's Bend was both dramatic and subtle. Thorne and Marsh went to trial and were convicted, sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The church underwent massive reorganization, new leadership brought in from outside, policies implemented to protect vulnerable members. Sheriff Webb resigned, and a new sheriff was elected, a woman, unexpectedly, who promised to take all complaints seriously regardless of who made them. The newspaper published a full account of the case, and it was picked up by papers across the territory. Leora's story became known far beyond Shepherd's Bend. not as a scandal, but as a testament to survival and the power of speaking truth. Journalists came to interview her, but she was selective about who she spoke to, wanting to control her own narrative rather than be defined by others. Through it all, Rhett stayed beside her. He never pushed, never demanded, just remained a constant, steady presence. They returned to Cedar Ridge after the trials concluded, and Jack and Martha welcomed them back like family. "You did it," Martha said, embracing Leora tightly. "You actually did it." "We did it," Leora corrected. "None of this would have been possible without all of you." Life in Cedar Ridge settled into a new rhythm. Leora began teaching reading and writing to the local children, finding purpose in helping the next generation learn to use their voices. She also started writing her own story, not for publication but for herself, a way of processing everything that had happened, of claiming ownership of her narrative. Rhett proposed on a spring evening 6 months after the trials ended. They were sitting on the porch of their cabin. Jack had given them the place permanently, considering it payment for all the work they'd done, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. "I'm not a man of many words," Rhett said, his rough hands holding hers gently. "But I know what I want. I want to build a life with you, Leora, not because I'm trying to save you or because I pity you, but because you're the strongest person I've ever met, and I can't imagine my days without you in them." Leora looked at this man who'd taken her in when she had nothing, who'd stood beside her through fire and blood and justice, who'd never asked her to be anything other than herself. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes." They married in a small ceremony with Jack and Martha as witnesses, Sheriff Jessup officiating. Emma, Sarah, and Catherine traveled from Shepherd's Bend to attend, bringing with them a quilt made by the women's group, each square sewn by a different survivor, each one representing a piece of healing. The years that followed weren't always easy. Leora still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched at unexpected sounds. There were days when the weight of what she'd endured threatened to crush her, when she couldn't get out of bed for the memories pressing down. But Rhett was there, patient and understanding, and the community they'd built around them, survivors and allies both, provided support when she needed it. She never forgot the 17 girls whose letters had started everything. She kept the tin box on a shelf in their cabin, a reminder of voices that had been silenced but not erased. Every year on the anniversary of Elias's execution, she would open it and read the letters again, speaking each name aloud, making sure they were remembered. 5 years after the trials, Leora's written account of her experiences was published. She'd been reluctant at first, but Emma had convinced her that her story could help others, could give courage to women still trapped in situations like the one she'd escaped. The book was titled Through Fire, One Woman's Journey from Victim to Survivor, and it became unexpectedly successful, translated into multiple languages, used in advocacy efforts across the country. With the royalties from the book, Leora established a fund to help women leaving abusive situations, money for travel, for legal fees, for starting new lives. The fund was administered by the women's group in Shepherd's Bend, ensuring that it reached those who truly needed it. The town itself continued to change. The church was eventually renamed, its dark history acknowledged rather than hidden. A memorial was erected bearing the names of Elias's victims, a permanent reminder that silence protects predators and speaking up protects the vulnerable. Leora and Rhett built a ranch of their own on land adjacent to Jack and Martha's property. They raised cattle and horses, their days filled with honest work and quiet contentment. Neighbors came to them for advice, for help, knowing they could be trusted. Children from the school would visit sometimes, asking Mrs. Calder to tell them stories, not about the dark times, but about courage and resilience, and how to stand up when everything in you wants to fall down. On a summer evening, 10 years after she'd first sat crying by the train tracks at Bitter Hollow Station, Leora stood in the wildflower meadow behind their house. The flowers bloomed in brilliant profusion, purple lupines and yellow sunflowers, white daisies and red Indian paintbrush. Rhett stood beside her, his arm around her waist, both of them watching the sun set over the mountains. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Everything you went through to get here?" Leora thought about the question carefully. She thought about the scars on her face and arms, the nightmares that still occasionally woke her, the years of running and fear. But she also thought about the women she'd helped, the changes she'd sparked, the life she'd built from ashes. "I regret what was done to me," she said finally. "I regret that Elias hurt so many people, that the system protected him for so long. But I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret surviving." She turned to look at her husband, this quiet man who'd given her safety and space to heal, who'd stood beside her through everything. "And I definitely don't regret you saying you're coming with me that night at the station." Rhett smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "Best decision I ever made." They stood in the meadow as the light faded, two survivors who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to build something beautiful from their broken pieces. The wildflowers swayed around them, and in the distance they could hear the laughter of children playing, the low of cattle settling for the night, the normal sounds of a life lived in peace. That night, Leora sat at her desk and opened her journal. She'd been keeping it faithfully for years now, documenting not just the trauma, but the healing, the small victories, the ordinary moments that made up a life reclaimed. She turned to a fresh page and wrote the date, then paused, thinking about what to say. Finally, she began to write. "Today I realized something. For years I defined myself by what was done to me, the fire, the scars, the betrayal. I was a victim, then a survivor, then an advocate. All of those things were true and necessary. But today, standing in the wildflower meadow with Rhett, watching the sun set over land we've made our own, I realized I'm something else now too. I'm simply a woman living her life, working hard, loving deeply, helping where I can, resting when I need to. The trauma is part of my story, but it's not the whole story anymore. Elias tried to destroy me. He burned my face, shattered my innocence, nearly ended my life. But he didn't succeed. I'm still here. I'm still growing. And the future I once couldn't imagine stretching before me is now so full of possibility that sometimes it takes my breath away. I forgive myself for surviving when others didn't. I forgive myself for the days I'm not strong, for the nights I still cry, for the moments when fear grips me and I want to run. I forgive myself for being human, for being imperfect, for being exactly who I am. He burned my face, but not my future. That I claimed for myself. And I'm going to keep claiming it, one day at a time, for the rest of my life. She closed the journal and set down her pen. Through the window, she could see Rhett banking the fire for the night, his movements careful and practiced. Beyond him, the stars were emerging, countless points of light in the darkness. Leora stood and moved to the window, looking out at the night. Somewhere out there, other women were suffering as she had suffered. Somewhere, other survivors were finding their voices, claiming their futures. The work was never done. The fight never completely won. But tonight, in this moment, there was peace. She touched the scarred side of her face gently, tracing the puckered skin that had once made her hide in shame. These scars were part of her now, a map of where she'd been and what she'd survived. They weren't beautiful, but they were honest. And she'd learned that honesty, about pain, about survival, about the messy work of healing, was more valuable than beauty ever could be. "You coming to bed?" Rhett called from across the room. "In a minute," she said. She took one last look at the stars, then turned away from the window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, she would rest beside the man who'd saved her not by fighting her battles, but by giving her the strength to fight them herself. Leora extinguished the lamp and joined Rhett, and as she settled into the warmth of their bed, surrounded by the life they'd built together, she felt something she'd never thought she'd feel again. Complete. The story that had begun with a woman hiding her face and crying by the tracks had ended with a woman who faced the world unafraid, who'd transformed her pain into purpose, who'd taken the ashes of her old life and used them to fertilize new growth. She had walked through fire and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken, and that made all the difference.